Hey y'all, so today we're going to finish up our lecture talking about the Great Depression. And today we're going to talk about the pop culture of the Great Depression. So let's pull this up. So the Great Depression, in terms of pop culture and media, was oh, my computer's frozen. Was kind of a decade of contradiction. So we saw a lot in art and media, a lot of traditionalism, but also a lot of modernist experimentation. In films and come on. In films and stories, there was a lot of sentimentality, but also a lot of kind of hard-boiled looks at the world as it really was. And let's see, sentimentality versus toughness. There was a longing for the past as well as dreams for the future with things like new science fiction novels. And a lot of Americans hungered for heroes. So one way that this manifested was in the popularization of comic books. So, in comics, you have heroes and a simpler version of the world. Good always triumphs, evil always fails. Detective stories were actually really popular. A lot of people forget this, but Batman is supposed to be a detective. They were cheap, colorful, and easy to read as more and more of the population of the United States was becoming literate. Comics were really popular, especially obviously with kids and teens. And they provided an escape. You're gonna see that escape is going to be a recurring theme when we are talking about the popular media of the 1930s. Of course, radio was important like it was in the 20s, but now radio became an essential part of daily life. Every single household had a radio. On the radio, you could see comedy, drama, news. FDR would have fireside chats where he would talk to the American population, which helped increase his popularity. There were radio dramas and radio plays. There was actually one radio drama in 1938, War of the Worlds, which is very famous because it was realistic. So people who tuned in partway through the drama thought that aliens actually were invading and called their local police. Luckily, so this is often blown up, and a lot of people they say that there was a national panic. That's not true. It was a local panic where the radio station was, but it's still a great story. Um, Excuse me. So, music as well was a happy diversion. It was a form of escape. And a lot of music involved social criticism. So, folk singers would focus on the harsh lives of African Americans as well as everyday Americans. Folk singers like Woody Guthrie wrote ballads about the Dust Bowl and the common person. Y'all have a link to a Woody Guthrie song in your modules that is then going to inform a poetry assignment you're going to be writing. This is where in class we would listen to these songs, but unfortunately, since we are not in class, you'll have to listen to them independently. Ironically, even though the economy was suffering, the film industry thrived during the 1930s. Again, because movies provide an escape from reality. So by the end of the 1930s, 65% of Americans attended the movies at least once a week. That is a massive proportion. I would say that number today is much, much lower, especially considering that we have on-demand media. Silent films were no longer really a thing in the 1930s. It was all talkies. The themes included distrust of the government, struggle of the common person. We have the first animated feature film with Snow White and the first color film with Wizard of Oz. And this is important because color is then going to start to become an expectation in film as well. We won't see black and white phased out entirely until about the 1960s, but color is going to become the new standard, just like talking film. Oh, I'm so sorry. Became the new standard after the late 1920s. So, bigger and better is the film industry in the 1930s. People want spectacle because they want to escape from the problems that they have in everyday life. So, because movies can now include sound, music, and eventually color, they need to be big, which means musicals are very popular because dancing and big band music was popular in the 1930s. And this also shows off the best abilities of talkies because being able to sync singing to sync music with film was a big deal. It's also meant that historical and Bible epics were really popular, such as Gone with the Wind, which you have a clip from Gone with the Wind. So in your in your modules, once you're done with your poetry project, there are a few movie clips that I would recommend you watch. Again, we would have watched these in class, but I recommend you watch these because they're going to help you with your last assignment, your time capsule assignment. So one of them is a clip from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It's Whistle While You Work. And I really want you to think about how much Disney's animation grew just in a span of a few years between Steamboat Willie and this first animated feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You're also going to see a clip from The Wizard of Oz in which Dorothy enters Oz and sees a world of color. I really want you to think about now, Wizard of Oz wasn't the first Technicolor film, but it was the first successful Technicolor film. And I really want you to think about being an audience member, a viewer who had only ever seen black and white movies and was now seeing this sequence in a movie theater. And then there's also a clip from the Fred Astaire film Swing Time, which features Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, who were household names in the 1930s. And I want you to think about, first of all, how this would be, how this movie would be received by people who, again, are looking for escapism, especially considering that Lucky, the Fred Astaire character, he's a character who's down on his luck. He's trying to find work as a dancer so that he can make money. So obviously, themes of the Great Depression there, struggling artist. So I also want you to think about how a lot of early musicals involved a lot of dancing, like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, because they were transitions from the vaudeville tradition. So that was basically stage entertainment prior to the film industry. All right, speaking of film industry, let's talk about Hollywood. So the 1930s start off what's called the golden age of Hollywood. This would last from the 30s until the 1950s. Um, this established many major studios like RKO, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Paramount, a lot of studios that you know today. This also established the studio system. So this was a system where stars signed contracts with a studio, and it was very exploitative. It was a bad deal for stars and for other people who worked in the film industry, because basically how it worked is if I am a Hollywood actress, and let's say that I'm not a big actress. I'm just a little nobody trying to get on the screen. So I sign a deal with Paramount and I start getting small roles. And then people like me, so I start getting bigger and bigger roles. Well, I'm still stuck with Paramount. And let's say an executive, I can't go to RKO, I can't go to some other studio and try to make films there. And let's say some executive decides they don't like me and I start not getting films. Well, I can't break my contract with Paramount, so I'm stuck in that position. That's what the studio system looks like. Um, you have a clip from Gone with the Wind, which is a few years after, is a little bit after Wizard of Oz, not a few years actually, but uses color in a very different way because it's not a fantasy film. And I want you guys to watch that. This is an example of an epic. It was a Civil War film from the perspective of the South. Censorship also became a big thing in Hollywood during the 1930s with the creation of the Motion Picture Production Code, better known as the Hays Code. I want you guys to call it the Hays Code, which was created in 1930. So this was a response to complaints that film's content had become too lewd. Here's an example of such lewd content over here with Betty Boop. So the film industry said, okay, well, we're going to try to prevent government censorship and we're going to censor ourselves before the government can come censor us. So they created the Hays Code. And this was a strict set of rules dictating acceptable content in films. So this actually shaped how a lot of films were made, and a lot of movies, you can watch them and kind of tell if they were made pre or post Hays Code. The Hays Code would be in effect until about 1960. And in the 60s, that's why you see such a massive insurgence in film in the 1960s of swearing, sex, drugs, rock and roll, violence, because the Hays Code was no longer in effect, preventing filmmakers from doing such things. So it's kind of a reactionary response. It's teenagers who have their first taste of freedom. So filmmakers would find sneaky ways to get around the code, and would openly mock the Hays office. In their films. So you don't need to write these down. These are just some examples of different Hays codes. And normally we'd have a lot of fun discussing this in class, but since we're not in class, I'll just give you a look at a few examples of different Hays codes. So crime and immorality could not be portrayed in a positive light. So no anti-heroes had to be punished, or if they were an anti-hero, they in the end they had to do the right thing. Films could only present correct standards of life. So what that means is if you have a character who is coded as homosexual, for example, they have to be punished in some way, or they have to be a joke. They cannot obviously be openly homosexual. That was not okay in the 1930s. If This also applied a lot to, I don't know, you wouldn't have, if a woman was an unwed mother in a film, she couldn't be a protagonist. She would have to be looked down on or seen as a pitiable character. The law had to be upheld and respected, with some exceptions for cartoons. Obviously, no nudity or overt portrayals of or references to sexual behavior. Religion cannot be depicted in a mocking manner. And you could not show drug or alcohol use unless it was necessary to the plot. And illegal narcotics were forbidden, even regardless of circumstances. So you couldn't show people using narcotics. You could suggest it, though. Um, there were no, you couldn't have any detailed depictions of crime because they were afraid that people would watch a detailed depiction of safe cracking, for example, and then go start cracking safes. You couldn't use revenge as a theme for a film which was set in modern time because it could be shown as glorifying violence. So this is why a lot of films started to become set in the past, because that really relaxed a lot of basically of these standards. If a movie was set in the past, you could have a little more violence. There was more leeway. So that was another reason for kind of biblical epics. Westerns became popular during the 1930s. Topics considered perverse could not be depicted anyway, such as, again, homosexuality or interracial relationships. Sanctity of marriage had to be upheld, so you couldn't show divorce, things like that. There could be no blasphemy or profanity, and I think might be cut off on your screen, but the US flag must be treated with the utmost respect. So I've provided in your modules a clip of Mae West. So a lot of directors got around the Hays Code using innuendos, using a lot of double speak. The Marx Brothers were excellent at this, using symbolism. A lot of them would openly mock the Hays Code because directors obviously thought it was ridiculous. All right, let's talk about art and literature. So the New Deal created 3 federal programs that funded art. The Federal Arts Project, which provided funding for visual arts, the Federal Writers Project, which provided funding for written works, and the Federal Theater Project, which, you guessed it, provided funding for theatrical works. So art, because of these projects, starts to become more popular. Because it creates jobs. This also creates a new norm of the government investing in the arts, and art is seen as more culturally valuable because art is creating jobs. So what were these people hired to do? Well, they weren't hired to just make their own art. They were hired specifically to create massive public murals, to beautify cities and then create jobs. And these murals would represent common Americans and their experience, as well as celebrating local history. Also, art was very experimental. During the 1930s, we see the growth of surrealism and cubism, these genres that were born in art in the 1920s, really starting to flourish and develop. So this is an example of one such mural depicting life in the 1930s. Here's another one. Public murals to beautify cities. We would talk about these if we were in person. If y'all have ever seen Parks and Recreation, they reference these projects a lot with the murals in the City Hall building. So you can see it's a lot of murals showing average people at work or local histories, the establishment of states, things like that. All right, so photojournalism emerges in the 1930s as an art form as well as a way of recording people's lives. So photographers who were paid by the WPA recorded common Americans and their experiences during the Depression. which led to photojournalism, which means recording people's stories through photographs. It's journalism that you do through photographs. Now, obviously, photojournalism, I put photojournalism was born here. That's not entirely true. Photojournalism was technically born during the Civil War, because you'll remember that journalists would travel with camps during the Civil War, and record Arby's experiences there. The most famous photographer from the 1930s is Dorothea Lange. And she took some of the most famous photographs of the Depression, including the portrait of a migrant mother that I'm sure all of you have seen at some point. So these are some examples of Dorothea Lange's photography, and we would talk about this if we were in class, but she definitely tried to record, the positive and the negative of everyday people's lives during the 1930s, including how people were living, and really wanted to show, um, the struggle people were going through. Common folks. Okay, so the American literary identity. So the Depression was a powerful unifying experience, not just in terms of unifying people, like with the growing labor movement, for example, but also in terms of creating a unifying artistic identity. So one way this was shown was through regionalism. So this meant that representing regions through writing and social criticism. So a lot of literature in the 1930s was regional, like I said. So it showed what it was like to live in the South, the Midwest. John Steinbeck, for example, was a regional writer who, wrote about the experiences of migrant workers and the people who were hit hardest by the Depression. William Faulkner depicted the American South through regionalism. And then writers who were hired for the WPA would record local histories and folklore, which contributed to regionalism. So they would travel the country and write down local histories for these towns and cities so that they were recorded, as well as local folklore, things like that, and created this great wealth of kind of Americana and American literature. All right. Experimental theater was also a growing field during the 1930s, largely because the Hays Code did not apply to stage writers. So, since the Hays Code didn't apply to people in theater, this meant that they could explore topics that filmmakers could not, such as race, sex, class, etc. The Black division of the FDP actually brought the stories of Black Americans to the stage, and there was a lot of theatrical experimentation. However, eventually the FDP dissolved because of claims that stage writers were promoting communist and socialist agendas, and we will talk more about this when we get to the 1950s, and we'll talk about McCarthyism. Okay, so in your module, I want to kind of show you what y'all have for this week, because I know this probably looks like a lot, but it's just these two assignments here. So you've got a song here that I would recommend you listen to before you do your Great Depression photography poems. It's a song by Woody Guthrie, I Ain't Got No Home in This World Anymore. Then you have these videos of content from films, and these will inform your 1930s time capsule assignment. So I'm not grading the links, but they will help you with answering your questions. All right, thank you very much, and let me know if you have any questions. All right, bye.